Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of All Things Crime. This is Jared, and I'm super excited today. We get to hear from Detective Brian Davis from SBI, Utah SBI, and I'll have him explain exactly what that is. But Brian had some pretty interesting news, especially that is relevant to not only me personally, but also the show and the state of Utah where we live. So, Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah, we've known each other for a few years now, so met a couple of times up there at your office. And so why don't you tell us about your big news?
Yeah, well, so we recently had a case that we were able to close successfully. It was from 1998, a unsolved homicide, and it took place. The body was recovered down in southern Utah near Lake Powell. It was again from 1998. We identified the victim in 2018, so it took 20 years to do that. It just, for lots of reasons, it was a really, really tough case to work on. Once the victim was identified in 2018, that opened up new doors for us, and through these new leads, it obviously we were able to learning who the victim was. We backtracked kind of her life, and we're able to ultimately close the case through some additional and advanced DNA technology.
Awesome. So could you give us a little history really of the victim and kind of what happened with as far as what you can put together, kind of the story of the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was from April 1998. There was a body that was discovered off the side of Highway 276, about 38 miles north of Lake Powell. It was discovered by was during the day, broad daylight, was visible from the side of visible from the highway. Two citizens driving were able to see something on the side of the road. They stopped, and they discovered that it was a body. They called the police from that point. So the victim was never identified. There's some unique things with the way that she was wrapped with different layers of plastic and duct tape, rope, a sleeping bag, and such. There were measures taken, not to get into too many details on that, to conceal her identity through fingerprints. So that was not an option, and they worked it pretty actively for a couple of years. So the Garfield County Sheriff and the State Bureau of Investigation with Utah, and ultimately the case just went cold, and they worked it the best that they could. They had several tips and leads that they worked off of. They even appealed to not to a large extent, but even to the media, to the public. This victim was entered into NamUs, the missing persons database, and after about 2 years of this, it went cold, and there was really nothing more to follow up on. In 2008. The case was requested to be reopened by one of our majors here with the State Bureau of Investigation. Things were worked off and on over the next few years as different tips and leads came in, and those tips would be worked until they were kind of dry up, so to speak, or hit a dead end. And ultimately, the case, I was requested to work on the case in 2016. And after a couple of years, we were able to identify the victim through NamUs, through photographs that were released, through the public's assistance, that we were able to identify her, which was huge, obviously. And previous to that identification, we worked lots of different angles, right? We looked at the evidence. It had been tested and retested in regard to trying to, find clues of what, of who this victim was and what had happened to her. And ultimately that the only DNA we ever got was from the victim herself. Never got any other DNA from that evidence. And these ultimately were able to identify her, and the case definitely took lots of twists and turns as we looked at people. Through the identification of her, we had people come forward from Ohio. So this victim went missing from Youngstown, Ohio in early April of 1998. And as the media release went out, we got the victim identified. We had people from Ohio specifically that contacted us. I was working closely with a detective in Youngstown, Ohio, Detective David Sweeney, and he was awesome. We started working together and cultivated a pretty good friendship over through this case.
So
These people,
if I might, really quick, before we actually talk into how you solved the case, describe a little bit what evidence you were dealing with. I mean, because it sounds like you said there were multiple layers around her, and so if you could kind of describe, the people that pulled over to the side of the road and discovered the victim, what was that status? I mean, what kind of describe how the victim was kind of packaged, if you would.
Sure. So her body was covered with plastic bags, duct tape. She was bound with rope, ankles, wrists, and then she was put inside a sleeping bag, and then that sleeping bag was wrapped up in a carpet. So there was multiple layers. It was pretty intricately packaged, so to speak, and placed there. Why it was placed there, we don't know. But so that was the evidence we had to deal with. Was ultimately, the plastic, duct tape, rope, a sleeping bag, and the carpet.
And the victim was found how many days you estimated? I think in the press releases I read around 10 days.
Yeah, she was reported missing April. It was April 8th of 1998, and she was found April 20th, so about 12 days.
And down there, I mean, it's still pretty warm down there, but at least it's not super humid. How would that affect her? Well, assuming it was only 12 days, but she's probably in a pretty bad state by then.
Well, actually, so in regard to that, she was very well preserved. When she was found, her body was frozen. So it had been, we can kind of only speculate there, but it had been in some type of a freezer, because in April near Lake Powell, it's certainly not cold. I mean, winter's over and it's, the climate's warmer there. So that her body had been in refrigerated and frozen. So when she was found, she was still frozen. So her body was, it was very well preserved.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah. That wasn't definitely didn't make part of the news articles. So interesting. So cause of death?
So the cause of death was determined to be a gunshot wound to the head.
Okay. And did they find much blood at the scene where they found her?
No, there wasn't actually. It appeared as though that site was just where the body was placed. I did not appear that's where not where the murder actually occurred.
Wow, that's an interesting twist right there. I mean, the fact that he shot her and then put her in a freezer. This guy was just, I mean, you don't hear about that kind of stuff very often.
Yeah, pretty unique, and definitely unique circumstances to where, how she was wrapped, placed, and all the things previous to that. So definitely unique that way.
Seems like I mean, especially if her body was in a freezer, maybe he put her in there long enough to go get the plastic and the sleeping bag and all this kind of stuff to try to hide her. But you'd think in all the places of Utah, he'd put her a little further away from just the side of a highway.
Exactly, and I had the same thought. To go to the effort that was that he did in up to that point, and then to have placed her where she was visible from the side of a highway is yeah. Those are questions that we just really ultimately, and we'll get into that, but where the suspect has been deceased since 2001.
Yeah.
Those are probably answers we'll never have, why that occurred, and why Utah, why that specific place. So
yeah, I don't know, maybe just looked on a map and said, well, that looks pretty remote, and it's just a little, I think on a big map, and for someone that's not really I'm just speculating here, but not necessarily familiar with Lake Powell and how much. So for those of you that don't know, that are listening from other parts of the world, but even those that may be from Ohio or on the East Coast, the southern part of Utah is fairly arid. It's kind of a high desert, and it's huge. You have to understand, you will drive for hours and hours and hours, and it just seems like some of those little highways go forever. And like it takes 6 hours to get to Las Vegas, and that's driving at a pretty good clip. So the western states are, when you describe how big a western state is to somebody on the East Coast, sometimes they just can't comprehend it, and say, especially in between cities, it's like Philadelphia and New York. People might think that, yeah, I mean, it may take a while because of traffic, but distance-wise, it's nothing. So it's the western states have a pretty good expanse, and for somebody that's from Ohio, it may make sense that they would, it just wouldn't matter. They'd think nobody drives on these roads anyway. But Lake Powell is a huge. I mean, there's tons of people that travel down there, especially in April. So people also need to know that April's kind of when it's starting to warm up enough that a lot of the wakeboarders and the serious boaters will start traveling down to Lake Powell from upstate New York, or I'm sorry, upstate Utah, as well as even Colorado and things. So what may appear as a fairly remote area really actually really isn't. So I'm just kind of trying to include, bring some people in on that might be listening and not familiar to the area. But would you agree with all that?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of open space in Utah and other surrounding states, but particularly down there, it's vast. Utah's got all kinds of, from the mountains to the desert to the reservoirs to, you've got Moab, Arches, Zions. It's vast, and there's a lot of open country. And you're right. I think a lot of people may not realize if you've never been down there, how open it really is. And so, and we can kind of talk about too, as we go from, if we want to talk about what we do know about the suspect in this case of why Utah. I mean, we can speculate to a point of why we think it would have been here. So,
Well, yeah. Let's go into that then. What any ideas?
well, you know, um, we don't really, again, know specifics of why Utah. The people that came forward after her identification, and by even by his own statements, the suspects at the time, and it should be noted too that uh, after she went missing April 8th, he never reported her missing. This was his wife of 2 years. He was not the one that reported her missing. So after 5 months, it was an aunt of the victim from Mexico who actually contacted police, ultimately police in Youngstown, Ohio, where the victim Lina Reyes and her husband Edward Geddes lived. So this aunt contacted police there to report Lina missing. So 5 months later, the husband had never contacted police. So he was interviewed at the time by police, and we have access to that interview that was recorded. It was suspect to them at the time. However, there was nothing really actionable on their part that could be done other than it was suspect. They had nothing really to go off of. So these people that came forward after Lina's identification, they helped to kind of paint a picture of her and her husband Edward. There was allegedly, we never could really quite verify this. Actually, there was a female. She's a reporter from the Youngstown, Ohio area, who at the time in 1998, when Lina went missing, she talked to some people, and she never could really confirm a lot of these facts. But there was apparently a neighbor who saw Edward loading something heavy, into a vehicle that was wrapped in carpet, things like that. So, in talking to other people and even family members of Edward at the time after she went missing, April 8th, even though he never contacted police, his story was that she was traveling. That he'd taken her to the airport. She was going to fly from Pittsburgh to Texas, and then take a bus into Mexico to see family. That was his story. And then, according to other people and family members, after she went missing, he got into his vehicle and a minivan, and he allegedly drove to Texas to look for her. He was gone for about 4 days, never found her, and then came back. So the speculation is at that point, that's when he would have traveled to Utah. And again, why Utah specifically, we don't know, but other than it's vast, it's far enough from Ohio. Again, no known connections, but if you're just driving and you're saying you're going to Texas, certainly Utah's in that driving range, right? And I don't know where else he would have driven, but I think it was just probably picked as an area. It was rural, remote, with no real connection to Ohio or to him, and there were steps taken on his part so she could not be identified. So that's what we do know. But again, where he's deceased, those are probably facts we'll never know of why. We can just speculate.
Yeah. As you were talking, I'm just trying to rack my brain. I'm like, how bizarre that she would end up in Utah. It's like, that we're a solid 2-day drive from Texas. We're, a day or more, full 24-hour drive basically to Mexico. It's like, wow. I mean, we're a long ways from there. And how, maybe you just saw all the desert area in Utah and just kind of picked a place on a map and then drove, and then I imagine in the middle of the night, if he, wanted to dump her somewhere, and he probably pulled over and there weren't any lights from any direction that he could see, and so he probably thought that was a really, really remote place and dumped her there. That's but it's pretty good indication that the fact that the husband, who you would think would be the most intimate person with the victim, that he would be the one to report her missing. I mean, any kind of a real relationship, that would, you would think that would happen for sure with the husband, as opposed to a family member from Mexico. That's pretty good indication. Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.